Good morning, and welcome to this week's edition of History Comes Alive. Hope you all had a wonderful Turkey Day with friends and family, either in person or perhaps virtually this year. Things will be better next year, I guarantee it. So we return now, and I'm back in the saddle to return to our discussions about history and culture. And today we're looking also at music. Now, I'm not a musicologist. I played cornet in the high school band. I'm a classical music fan. But so I'm not an expert in the art of music itself, but I want to share with you my observations as we explore the life and times of George Frideric Handel. And of course, we'll focus on especially his great oratorio, Messiah. You'll notice the mistake on this 19th century score up here. It's not the Messiah. I will show you later on the actual autograph score by Handel himself in his own hand. The title is Messiah. A little bit of historical trivia there. And these other images show the many guises in which we have Handel's great oratorio, and especially the Hallelujah Chorus, presented in media over the really centuries, going even before recorded media. Here's a fairly staid approach on this CD. Here's a soulful celebration of Handel's Messiah, a more contemporary approach. And I want to play for you another version, which some of you may recall. This is from the 1980s, a group very popular at the time. I think they've since disbanded. You may recognize their style, though, just these opening notes from their arrangement of the Hallelujah Chorus. Definitely not a reverent rendering of that tune by the great pop group Mannheim Steamroller. Well, the Hallelujah Chorus, taken from Messiah, is of course the most popular single work in the classical choral repertoire. And the chorus and Messiah itself, a near instantaneous hit at the time of its premiere in 1742. And now 250 plus years later, Messiah is still sung all over the English-speaking world. Now, we're going to talk about more than the Hallelujah Chorus, of course, in this program, but it will be with us always because some of you may recognize in the background of my slides is the first page of the autograph score of the Hallelujah Chorus. Now, one issue I'm going to address right up front here, and that is the question of why we stand, why the audience stands during the Hallelujah Chorus. This was first reported in 1756 in a newspaper of the day, and there was a story told that King George II heard the performance and stood in the audience. But in fact, there is no record. You know, historians, we always like to find actual evidence of stories and legends. There's no actual record that the king ever attended a performance of Messiah or the Hallelujah Chorus. So that legend remains simply that, a legend, still honored today, of course, when the Hallelujah Chorus is performed, mostly at Christmas time, although, as I will point out, it is in fact a composition for Easter, for Lent, not Christmas. In any event, we'll go beyond the musical details to talk about the universal appeal of Handel and his music, an extraordinary figure who created this masterpiece of Western musical culture. And also, I have to say that Messiah and the Hallelujah Chorus have also been exploited for popular entertainment. Here is a scene you may recall from that classic Christmas movie of 1989, Christmas Vacation. This is the scene where the Griswolds have had problems getting their 25,000 Christmas lights to turn on. And Mom goes into the basement, contemplates, figures it out, and you see the result in this short clip from YouTube. Well, there you have it. So let's leave behind the world of popular entertainment and go back to some historical context now. I am a historian after all. And talk about the times in which Handel lived and worked. England in the 18th century, early 18th century, was prospering. It was a unified state now, known as Great Britain. The dynastic and religious quarrels were over. The Parliament shared power with the king. There's George I, ruler from 1714 to 727 on the right. This was a time of political stability in England, freedom of expression. Trade and colonial expansion had brought about a vibrant economy, and the traditional wealth of the aristocracy was giving way to an educated, growing middle class. If you were an ambitious native or foreigner, the best place to be in England was London, shown there in a early 18th century engraving. Population of London at this time was about 700,000. 1/5 the population of England lived in London. London was 10 times bigger than any other city in the country. And the social and political life revolved not around the court, as in the past, but in the clubs, the coffee houses, theaters, concert halls. People had time on their hands, and they had money to spend on entertainment. Creative artists could make a lot of money if they had talent and the urge to compete. Here's a quote from a commentator from 1713, very appropriate. Quote, "In these times, whoever wishes to be eminent in music goes to England. In Italy and France, there is something to be heard and learned. In England, there is something to be earned." And that very much is a summary of Handel's life as a musical entrepreneur. Handel, of course, as many of you know, was not English by birth. He was born in Halle in Saxony, present-day Germany, in 1685. Actually born the same year as Johann Sebastian Bach, the other great Baroque master. As far as we know, they never met, however. And on the right is the earliest photograph taken from a painting of young Handel at age 20. We don't know much about his private life. He wrote very few letters, although his professional life was very well documented in newspapers and second-person accounts, but he didn't speak himself much for the historical record. He had an independent streak early on. He defied his father. His father was a surgeon, wanted him to be a lawyer, and my apologies to any attorneys in the audience, but the world perhaps did not need another attorney given the opportunity to have Handel on the scene. The story is told when he was a youngster, he smuggled a clavichord, an early keyboard instrument, into the attic of his home to practice. Had a tremendous belief in himself and his musical genius early on. He was a musical prodigy on the keyboard initially. He became a church organist at age 18, and in the early 1700s, he worked in an opera house orchestra in Hamburg, Germany. And in 1706, he began a period of 4 years wandering throughout Europe, seeking fame and fortune. He ended up in Florence, in Venice, in Rome. He wrote operas, he wrote vocal music for the church, and he developed his non-musical skills. He had a knack for schmoozing with cardinals, dukes, aristocrats. He garnered wealthy patrons, mingled in high society. And in 1710, he found himself back in Germany as the court conductor for the gentleman with the extravagant wig on the left, George Ludwig. George was the Elector of Hanover, a hereditary, princely position in Germany. And as soon as he landed in George Ludwig's court, Handel decided to take a leave of absence for a year to go to London to write music for a fledgling opera company. He must have seen he had a great future in London. He goes back to Germany for a time, he's bored. Finally, 1712, he leaves London for good, leaving behind, for a time, his employer, George Ludwig. Well, what consumed Handel for the next 20 years was opera, specifically Italian opera, which he'd gotten a taste for during his travels in Italy. Altogether, he wrote 42 operas and found himself affiliated with several opera houses. One of them, shown here, the Queen's Theatre, hosted a number of his early operas. But he was not just a composer of operas. He also managed the productions. He hired the singers, conducted the orchestra, often invested in the productions himself. Really an impresario on the lines of Andrew Lloyd Webber today in the musical scene. Handel insisted on control over his productions. He accepted the risks and retained the profits. And this is an important characteristic when you look at Baroque music generally. Bach, for example, wrote principally for the church, whereas Handel wrote for a paying public audience. A very different approach, and I think that's reflected, and I'll talk about that as we proceed, that's reflected in his style of musical composition as well. Now, opera is a very tough business, still is. Operas, even in the Baroque era, were big, loud, expensive productions, pyrotechnics, live animals, cutthroat competitors, and very difficult artists. One story is told about two prima donnas that Handel had hired for one of his operas. They came to blows on the stage. Another anecdote told by Handel's first biographer is that when one diva soprano hired for one of Handel's operas refused to sing an aria, he threatened to throw her out the window. So very tough business. And I thought I would, because opera formed such an important part of Handel's early career as a professional impresario, I thought I would play for you a very short excerpt from one of his operas. A rare look at a Baroque opera, I think, for many of you. I had occasion to actually see a Baroque opera, one of Handel's operas, at the Metropolitan Opera in New York a few years ago. Very different kind of experience. Not much happens in Baroque opera. It's mostly a vehicle for magnificent singing. So I'm going to play for you a short excerpt from Handel's opera Ariadante. Premiered in 1735, it's set in Scotland. It involves two rivals for the hand of the daughter of the king. And you'll see at the beginning of this clip, the king's daughter's image comes down, kind of a cameo down from the ceiling, from the upper works of the stage. And you'll see the hero singing an aria to a friend of his. The aria is entitled "Love Takes Its Flight." Now you'll notice the hero singing is a woman, but singing a men's role in the opera. This was very common in the Baroque era. These roles for men were sometimes sung by castrati, men who had been surgically altered to render their voice in a higher range. Nowadays, these roles are typically sung by mezzo-sopranos in what's called a trouser role, where they dress up as men and meet the vocal demands of these male roles in Baroque operas. So you'll see a very bouncy, kind of florid style, very typical of a Baroque opera. So now I will exit my PowerPoint briefly and bring up a short excerpt from Ariadante. Well, you get the general idea. And of course, this is only a small, not only a small portion of the opera, it's a small portion of the aria. It actually goes on for more than 5 minutes, repeating these vocal lines, again, very florid, very highly ornamented, an acquired taste, to be sure, even back then, certainly today as well. Well, Handel was involved in other musical activities besides opera early in his career. Fortunately, his old boss, George Ludwig, became king of England in 1714. What a coincidence, a lucky coincidence. The previous monarchs, William and Mary and Anne, had no children, and the Parliament invited George to become king. Even though he couldn't speak English, it was a way to keep the Catholic Stuarts from reclaiming the throne. So now we have a new king, George I, and Handel's connections pay off because the king hires him as a harpsichord teacher for the royal family, hires him as composer to the Chapel Royal, and as part of his duties, Handel wrote ceremonial music for various state occasions. Some of these works were performed in the open, in huge pleasure gardens. For example, the music for the royal fireworks, composed for an outdoor festival in 1749. The rehearsal alone drew 12,000 spectators, caused a 3-hour traffic jam of carriages in London. And so I'll play for you an excerpt from another one of these great outdoor spectacles, the water music composed in 1717. And it shows Handel here seated next to his patron, King George I, on a barge along the Thames River. And any list of the top 10 hits of Handel will certainly include music from the water music. By 1723, Handel had acquired a permanent home. He leased a townhouse in the up-and-coming Mayfair neighborhood of London, and here is the building in which Handel lived for the rest of his life. His portion of the building is here, 25 Brook Street in Mayfair, and there are 2 plaques on the building. You can see one here. There's another plaque over here because next door at 23 Brook Street, much later on, Jimi Hendrix lived. So this complex together is now known as the Handel and Hendrix Museum in London. Well, Handel by now, as well as having nice domestic arrangements, he's doing well financially. He has a servant and a business manager. He entertains in his townhouse. He collects art, including 2 Rembrandts, and his position in London society is proven when in 1727, by Act of Parliament, he becomes a naturalized English citizen. Now, a problem for Handel is developing, however. The English public is growing weary of Italian opera, Italian-style operas, increasingly seen as an unnatural import. Public tastes moved against this flowery musical style, these confusing plot lines, effete singers, especially the castrati. And as you can see, I love this photograph, again, of a painting of Handel from 1731 without his wig. This is a guy who's not going to take the problem of declining operatic popularity lying down. He's a hard-working guy, determined to find the next best thing to continue his meteoric career. And his solution is to invent a new musical form, the English oratorio. The first of his oratorios, Esther, appeared in 1732. And there's an example, an excerpt from the original playbill on the left. So these oratorios of Handel combined two notions. First of all, English church music, for which there was an ample supply of performers, and combined that with the dramatic narrative style of opera. These oratorios were staged in theaters, not in churches. They were cheaper to produce than operas, no need to hire high-priced singers, no need for costumes or scenery, and especially during Lent, these oratorios could substitute for opera, which was not performed during Lent. And in terms of content, these oratorios, basically stories, mostly from the Old Testament, set to very simple, robust music, very accessible to the public. And they also appealed to the spirit of the times. Very often, Handel would use the heroes and heroines of ancient Israel to strike a parallel with the greatness of the English nation at his time, and the idea that the people of England were divinely favored, a chosen people, just like the ancient Israelites. Well, Handel composed 42 oratorios in all, 42 operas. His last one was presented in 1741. From then on, his principal production output consisted of oratorios, of which he wrote 29. The greatest of his oratorios, of course, is Messiah. There you see, there's no the, it's simply Messiah, an oratorio, written in 3 weeks in August and September of 1741. First performed in this building here, a music hall in Dublin, in April of 1742 during Lent. Handel had been invited to present a series of programs in Dublin, and there were, in fact, issues with presenting a religious work in a secular setting like a theater as popular entertainment. Jonathan Swift, for example, the dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, refused to lend his choir to perform in Messiah at its premiere. He referred to Handel's musicians as a club of fiddlers. This criticism against the religious theme of Messiah was allayed, however, when Handel agreed to allow the proceeds to be used to support charity, in particular 2 hospitals in Dublin and a society for the relief of prisoners held in prison for failure to pay their debts. Well, even in rehearsal, it looked like Handel had a smash hit on his hands. Here's a quote from the Dublin Journal in 1742. Yesterday, Mr. Handel's new grand sacred oratorio, The Messiah, again, editorial error there, was rehearsed to a grand, polite, and crowded audience. It was performed so well that it gave universal satisfaction to all present and was allowed to be the finest composition of music that ever was heard. Ads subsequently appeared for the performance itself, advising that gentlemen should not wear swords, ladies should not wear hoop skirts in order to pack more people into the theater. Well, Handel returned to London after this performance in Dublin. Has limited success with the oratorio in London. The subject matter is still seen as controversial. And several times when it was performed in London, the title was left out. Messiah was felt to be sacrilegious to appear in print. It was advertised as a new sacred oratorio. It was only performed twice in London in that first year, then shelved for a couple of years. One great critic of the oratorio was this gentleman shown here on the right, Charles Jennens. Jennens wrote the libretto for Messiah, essentially selecting and rearranging passages from the New and Old Testament to provide the text for the music. At one point, Jennens wrote, and I quote, "Handel's Messiah has disappointed me. Being set in great haste, I shall put no more sacred words into his hands to be thus abused." Jennens also had a beef at one point with some minor changes in the libretto that Handel made. And he referred to Handel's manager, John Smith, when he said, I quote, "Handel and his toad-eater Smith did all they could to murder the words." Well, they later reconciled, and in due course, Jennens wrote, "I have with great difficulty made him correct some of the grossest faults in the composition, but he retained his overture obstinately, in which there are some passages far unworthy of Handel, but much more unworthy of the Messiah." Well, Handel was used to dealing with creative types, didn't let it bother him. By the way, as to that criticism of Jennens, that the oratorio was written in great haste, indeed it was, as I said, written in 3 works, not as a result of any divine inspiration, but that's simply how Handel and Baroque composers in general worked. It was a business. They were very practical people, very prodigious in their musical output. Now, I'm going to return to Messiah in a few minutes. I wanted to briefly pause here and take a look at Handel the man. Handel is a guy we'd love to meet. I'm not particularly excited about the prospect of getting onto a time machine and meeting Johann Sebastian Bach, for example. We could admire the counterpoint, the abstract beauty of Bach's music, but he was really a dull family man, provincial or pious, introverted. Handel was a guy you would want to have a beer with at the pub across the street, a character larger than life. He had a hot temper. He was loud, arrogant, stubborn, profane. He knew 5 languages and could swear in all of them. But he was generally good-natured. His biographer wrote, and I quote, "Handel's general look was somewhat heavy and sour, but when he did smile, it was like the sun bursting out of a black cloud." And I like to think this image on the right from this statue of Handel carved in 1738 really reflects that. He looks like sort of a stern pixie there in marble, playing on his lyre, again, without benefit of his wig. Just a wonderful character. Besides collecting art, which I already mentioned, eating was the only pastime recorded for Handel. He would hold dinner parties in his home, but always kept the best food and wine for himself. On the left is a 1754 engraving entitled "The Charming Brute," and there's a caption at the bottom that says, "The figure is odd, but who would think? Within this barrel of food and drink there dwells the soul of soft desires." You can see here they've even put a little pig snout on poor Handel playing the organ. Speaking of soft desires, there were no women that we know of in Handel's life, or men either. And despite his hard-charging business sense as an impresario, Handel was loyal and generous to his friends and supporters. When he became successful, he sent money to his widowed mother in Germany. And he was also a founding member of the Society for the Support of Decayed Musicians, which provided financial help to musicians in old age. The greatest example of Handel's generosity involves his association with the Hospital for the Maintenance and Education of Exposed and Deserted Young Children, otherwise known as the Foundling Hospital. This was actually an orphanage in London, raised babies that had been abandoned due to the stain of illegitimacy. There were about 1,000 illegitimate babies born every year in London. Many of them ended up here at the Foundling Hospital. Now, it was still under construction in 1749 when Handel conducted a charity performance of the Hallelujah Chorus, with the ticket proceeds benefiting the hospital. In 1750, Handel donated this organ to the Foundling Hospital Chapel, and that same year led a full performance of Messiah. And starting in 1751, Handel conducted 2 performances every year at the Foundling Hospital after Easter. Overall, Handel was directly responsible for raising 10,000 pounds sterling for the hospital, the equivalent of about $2 million today. He also left the manuscript copy of the Messiah score to the Foundling Hospital in his will. And a few years ago, my wife and I visited London. We visited, of course, Handel's home, enjoyed a music recital there in the flavor of the rehearsals that would have been held there in Handel's own time, and also visited the Foundling Hospital, which has a wonderful room devoted to artifacts and mementos of the life and times of George Frideric Handel. Well, these performances of the Messiah oratorio really cemented Handel's reputation with the public and with posterity. Handel's last public performance was playing the harpsichord for Messiah in April of 1759. A week later, he died quietly in his bed at Brook Street. He had been a bit of a recluse for his last few years. He had cataracts. His eyes had been failing him since 1751. Later, he became totally blind. Had the misfortune of seeing the same eye doctor as Johann Sebastian Bach. But he died rich. He was worth, according to his estate, about 30,000 pounds sterling, about $6 million in today's currency. And he left most of his estate to his niece in Germany. 3 days before Handel died, he wrote a codicil to his will requesting burial in Westminster Abbey, the site where so many hundreds of famous Britons have been buried and memorialized. Handel paid £600 out of his own pocket for this monument, shown on the left. And I want to read for you the inscription on this monument. Very interestingly, it doesn't praise the musical art of Handel. It reads like a playbill with a list of donors, and very cleverly reflects the business sense, the importance of patronage, financial support in this very cutthroat business of being a composer and impresario in 18th century London. Here's what it says on Handel's monument, quote, "Within these sacred walls, the memory of Handel was celebrated," and it's referring to a concert, a memorial concert. "The memory of Handel was celebrated under the patronage and in the presence of His Most Gracious Majesty George III. The music performed on this solemnity was selected from his own works under the direction of Brownlow, Earl of Exeter, John, Earl of Sandwich, Henry, Earl of Uxbridge, Sir Watkin Wynne, Esquire, and Sir Richard Bart. The band, consisting of 75 vocal and instrumental performers, was conducted by John Bates, Esquire, and that is the memorial left to Handel in Westminster Abbey. According to the engraving on the right from 1787, Handel evidently went to heaven to the singing of angels, as we see in the apotheosis of Handel. Handel, of course, left quite a legacy in the musical world. The first full-length biography of any musician was Handel's biography, which appeared about a year after his death. In the 1760s, other charity festivals were held around England using performances of Messiah. On the left is a commemorative event at Westminster Abbey, held in 1784, involved 500 singers. And in the 19th century, the performances of Messiah got bigger and bigger. Remember, Handel's original personnel list indicated 75, and that's on the high end. He would usually have about 20 to 25 singers, maybe 30 musicians. But now you can see on the right a performance in the Crystal Palace in London, 1857, with 2,000 singers. Later on, in 1883, there was a performance in the same venue with 4,500 singers. This prompted the critic George Bernard Shaw to write, and I quote, "Why, instead of wasting huge sums on the multitudinous dullness of a Handel festival, does not somebody set up a thoroughly rehearsed and exhaustively studied performance of the Messiah in St. James Hall with a chorus of 20 capable artists? Most of us would be glad to hear the work seriously performed once before we die." Well, in fact, into the 20th century, we have seen a revival of smaller scale performances of Messiah, and of course, sing-alongs, perhaps not this year, but I'm sure they'll return next year, and I'm sure many of you have had an opportunity to participate in those and will enjoy that again. The universal appeal of Messiah continues. It's not really church music. There's no preaching involved, but ultimately, it's a dramatic musical story of hope, suffering, and redemption. And I want to share with you some music now. I've been talking quite a bit. You may be interested to hear something other than the sound of my own voice. And so I want to present to you a few musical excerpts, very short excerpts from Handel's music, and particularly from Messiah, and hopefully these will enhance your future listening or performance yourself in Handel and Messiah sing-alongs. So the first example, and by the way, I have a series here. One of the things I think that makes, again, I'm coming to this not from the standpoint of a musicologist, but just a fan of classical music, an avid listener. One of the things that I find so appealing about Handel's music generally is it's so accessible. And in the oratorios, there's a pictorial quality to his writing, a kind of a tone painting, which really adds dimension to the religious text underlying the music. So I want to start out here with an excerpt from another Handel oratorio, Israel and Egypt, to demonstrate my point. This is from an excerpt, "The land brought forth frogs." Of course, Israel and Egypt relates to the plagues that descended upon Egypt during the time of the captivity of the Hebrews. So listen to Handel's treatment of frogs. You can almost hear them bouncing across the page. I don't think Bach would write the land brought forth frogs. Somehow doesn't seem an appropriate topic for one of Bach's cantatas. Here's another example from Israel and Egypt. And we're going to hear flies and lice in a musical setting by Handel. Now moving on to Messiah. Here's a bass solo from the oratorio, and you'll get a sense of shaking the heavens. The musical line actually shakes, a visual or an auditory replication of the biblical text.
The Lord of hosts, yet once a little while, and I will shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land, and I will shake, and I will shake.
Again, a wonderful example of the pictorial quality in Handel's music. Next excerpt is a chorus from Messiah. All we like sheep have gone astray. And what you will see here, or hear, I should say, you will hear in your mind, you see in your mind, but you will hear the vocal lines separate and begin to go astray as though they represent sheep wandering across the fields. A very clever technique, again, pairing the music to the message of the words. And the final excerpt is, in this section, is, I think, quite clever, but typically in the mode of Handel, from the great bass air, "The Trumpet Shall Sound." There's a line, "We shall be changed." And the last time, actually the next to the last time that the singer says, "We shall be changed," you'll hear the music change. The pitch shifts up in a very clever fashion, again, mirroring the words.
We shall be changed, we shall be changed, and we shall be changed. We shall be changed.
And then, of course, it resolves itself. Here's some other examples. Again, there are dozens of these throughout the oratorio and in Handel's works. Generally, a great variety of emotions and moods that Handel is able to express with his music. And I think this derives in large part from his history as a composer of operas, really able to exploit the full range of emotional potential in the human voice, again, in concert with the meaning of the text. So the first example is from, again, a bass aria, "The People That Walked in Darkness." And you'll hear a very dark musical setting of this text. And with the approach of the word "a great light," this minor dark key will suddenly resolve itself into a major key. So listen for that in this short excerpt.
The people that walked in darkness, that walked in darkness,
My next example, I wanted to draw an analogy here between one of Handel's secular works and Messiah. And of course, like all composers of the era, Handel would freely adapt tunes of his own and of other composers, work them into his pieces, and also incorporate popular dance rhythms, if you will. So I'm going to play for you first a jig from Water Music, kind of a bouncy 6/8 rhythm, a dance rhythm, and you'll see how he incorporates that same rhythm in the next aria from Messiah, Rejoice Greatly, O Daughter of Zion. You can tap along with your toe and you'll get a sense of what I'm referring to here. So again, first Water Music and then Messiah. And now that same rhythm in a different setting. There's a clue, if you will, to the enduring popularity of Messiah, and again, Handel's work generally. The next excerpt is a tenor aria from Messiah, and you'll hear strong blows in the strings, just paralleling the text and also conveying a sense of great power and even agitation in this musical selection.
Thou shalt break them, thou shalt break them with a rod of iron.
And finally, a piece for, this is actually a soprano and mezzo duet. I'll play the opening for He Shall Feed His Flock Like a Shepherd. And this tune could appear in any one of Handel's operas. Just the expressiveness of the female voice, the beautiful coloring, sweetness and light in this excerpt from Messiah. So you see the incredible array of emotions presented in the space of a single work, very characteristic of Handel. And again, I think it's a key to the universal appeal of Messiah. So I want to end as, well, how else could I end? Even though the Hallelujah Chorus does not end Messiah, there's about another 40 minutes of music after the Hallelujah Chorus. But it's such an iconic element of the oratorio, I just had to end with it. And this is a version perhaps like you have not heard before. It's performed by, well, John Eliot Gardner at the helm, with the English Baroque soloists playing on period instruments and the Monteverdi Choir, 32 soloists. So we have a total of 32 in the chorus, 31 in the band. So we have 63 performers, pretty much the maximum that would have performed this work in Handel's day. And so what this imparts to this old chestnut, which I'm sure you've heard hundreds of times, this is not the Mormon Tabernacle Choir version of the Hallelujah Chorus, which to my ears, it's loud, it's noisy, but very hard to understand the words. You'll hear with this version an incredible clarity in the voices. It's like hearing it really for the first time. The diction is flawless, the music is light, for the most part, of course, comes to a powerful conclusion. And this is very close to what would have been heard in 1742 when Messiah premiered in Dublin. So I'll play this for you, and as you listen to the magnificent interplay of the voices, hopefully this will give new meaning to the text and give you an opportunity to really contemplate the creative genius of Handel and the message that his oratorio leaves for us this upcoming Christmas season, and really for any season. At the end of the oratorio on his manuscript score, Handel wrote the letters SDG, Latin abbreviation for Glory Be to God. A very appropriate and fitting end for this magnificent work, and so appropriate for the holiday season. This time I'll look and see if we have any comments or questions across the transom. No? Well, I've enjoyed having you here today to explore the life, times, and incredible music of George Frideric Handel. Next week, we're going to have some fun, I think. Christmas, as it approaches, of course, is a time to think about gift giving and to think about toys that often constitute those gifts. And so we'll give you an opportunity to reminisce next week as I talk about the wonderful world of classic toys, highlighting the fascinating origins of many of the popular toys and games that made such an impact in our own lives as children and still delight the grandkids even today. So between now and then, think about some of your own favorite toys. Maybe I'll be able to discuss some of them. If you do have a particular favorite that is still in your possession, you're welcome to send me a photograph, and I'll see if I can include some of those in my program next week to make this really an interactive presentation with feedback and input from my loyal audience here at Willow Valley. So again, thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you next week as we explore the wonderful world of classic toys.